If you are visiting with us this morning, we'd like to welcome you to Calvary Chapel. We're excited that you've come to worship with us. We have been studying through the book of Romans. We've been taking chapter by chapter, verse by verse, and we're just making our way, and we find ourselves in the 13th chapter of the book of Romans. Now, I want you to know something, that I didn't plan this. It wasn't something that I'm not smart enough to do that. I'll just be straight with you. Because if I was going to choose a sermon to give today for our nation, it would be this sermon. It would be this passage. It would be where we're at in the book of Romans, Romans chapter 13, because what we have in the book of Romans is the clearest statement in all of Scripture concerning the function, the role, and the origin of civil government. And we're going to have the opportunity this morning to make our way through here. And I think it's important as we're going through this text is that we understand that the Christian life is much more than what we do at church. It's much more than what we do in our devotion time. And if you're a Christian, those are things that you should be doing. I don't want to lessen that in any way. We should be men and women who are in the Word. We should be men and women who have a prayer life, that we're spending time with God and communing with Him, and then hearing what He has to say to us on a daily basis. And then we are those who attend church on a regular basis, that we realize that it's something, a very important part of our life, and it's something that God's commanded us to do in the Scriptures. And those, not to lessen those in any way. But that isn't where it ends. You see, our Christian life goes way beyond what we do in our spiritual time. It's how you live your life in the public. And it's how you live your life as a citizen. It's how you live your life in the workplace. You see, the Christian life isn't bound to four walls. The Christian life is who you are. And Paul the Apostle is going to deal with that particular subject, and he's already been dealing with that subject. If you remember kind of what he's encouraged us, that we're not to get vengeance on anybody, that's God's job, that we're not the one who gives justice, that's God's job, right? He lays out these very important principles for us as we're going through the book of Romans. And we're going to read the first 7 verses, and then we're going to come back, and then we'll expound upon them. Chapter 13, verse 1. Let every soul be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God. And the authorities that exist are appointed by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authority resists the ordinance of God, and those who resist will bring judgment on themselves. For rulers are not a terror to good works, but to evil. Do you want to be unafraid of the authorities? Do what is good, and you will have praise from the same. For he is God's minister to you for good, but if you do evil, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is God's minister, an avenger to execute wrath on him who practices evil. Therefore, you must be subject, not only because of wrath, but also for conscience sake. For because of this, you also pay taxes, for they are God's ministers, attending continually to this very thing. Render, therefore, to all their due, taxes to whom taxes are due, customs to whom customs, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor. Quite interesting that we find ourselves in this passage, and right after an election, and a very heated election, and then we find ourselves in this passage when we're watching throughout many of the big cities of our nation having protests, and I would even say riots and anarchy taking place. And we come as Christians to go, what does God say on the subject of government, and really where's our role, and where do we fit in, and what our responsibilities are when it comes to the subject of government. And we want to jump right in. And look what he says there in verse 1 of chapter 13. He says, let every soul be subject to the governing authorities. That you and I have a responsibility, and what he lays out is that we are to be subject to that government. The word subject is an interesting word. It means to put yourself into subjection to submit oneself to yield to one's admonition or advice. And so he's telling us very clearly that we're to bring ourselves under the authority that's been established. I like the way the King James Version reads verse 1. It says it like this. It says, "Let every soul be subject unto the higher powers, for there is no power but of God, and the powers that are ordained are of God." It's interesting because he takes that word authority and governing, and he says, look, these are the powers that have been established. Now, that word governing in your text there in verse 1, it talks about having being superior in rank, or someone who's over. And the word authority that he uses here, and it's the word exousia that's in the scripture. I want to read you, Hughes wrote this in his commentary. He says, the two words by which the term exousia is translated, power and authority, are very important terms for our understanding the nature of government. What does authority mean? In the English word authority, we find the smaller word author. So authority has something to do with authorship and ownership. God is the ultimate author of all things, for he is the creator who owns what he creates and who has the right to rule and to govern his creation. That's the root meaning of the word authority. In its actual function meaning, authority means that one has the right to impose obligations, to issue commands, which others are responsible and morally accountable to obey. Parents have authority over their children, so they have the right to command obedience from their children. Teachers in schools have authority over their students. They have the right to give assignments, to state requirements, and the students are responsible and culpable if they fail to accomplish them. Therefore, the whole concept of authority is important to Christians. For the Christian life is profoundly concerned with obedience, and obedience means conforming to authoritative obligation that are set before us from a source of authority. Man, what a great perspective. Look, guys, who is the author of everything? God. And if God's the author of it all, then he has the right to establish what you and I are to bring ourselves into subjection to. That's what the word authority comes from. And that's the idea behind it. And it's interesting that he doesn't just tell us, look, we're to be subject to the authorities, but he tells us why we're to be subject to the authorities. Notice what he says there at the end of verse 1, for there is no authority except from God. And the authorities that exist are appointed by God. In other words, authorities exist by God's sovereignty. That God is the one who establishes authority, and therefore he establishes government. And no government can exist except God allowing it, or because of God's ordinance to allow it to exist. Now, does that mean that God approves all governments? Not at all. You see, here's the deal. We look at Hitler and we look at Stalin, and God is just as offended, or more so than you and I could ever be, concerning how these men governed. But the reality is there's still governments, and even their governments were ordained by God. Sometimes God will allow governments to come into power to bring judgment against the world, or judgment against particular people. And what's interesting is that you and I still have the fundamental responsibility to render civil obedience in spite of our agreement or disagreement with the governing authorities. Now, what's interesting, and I love how Augustine put it. I think Augustine said it best. Augustine's viewpoint was that government is a necessary evil. Not that in and of itself government is evil, but government is made necessary by evil. Which is to say that in an unfallen world, there's no need of human government. There is much to commend this theory because the first use of force that we'll find in sacred scripture is found after the fall. We recall that God governed directly his creatures, Adam and Eve, by imposing law upon them from the very beginning of creation. So law existed from the very beginning, and there was government in the sense that God was the law enforcement agency behind those laws, but there were no lesser authorities. Since God was the enforcement agency, there's no lesser authorities under God. We don't see any governors, any kings, any emperors in the Garden of Eden. Watch what he says. But then they disobeyed God as a punishment of their act of disobedience. They're expelled from Eden. What happened then? God placed an angel, check it out, with a flaming sword at the entrance of Eden to guard it from further trespasses by Adam and Eve and their progeny. So the first law enforcement officer who appears in Scripture is an angel, a minister of God, sent from heaven with the instrument of coercion, an instrument of force at his command to enforce the bearing of access into Eden. The first action of government is to use the methods of force to restrain evil. When we work that out, we see that the first responsibility of government is to preserve, to maintain, and to promote human life. So government exists to make the continuity of life possible, because in a fallen world, people are left only to anarchy, which really means the unlimited and unrestrained power of the strong over the weak. And so the human institutions of government that are set up are necessary because of evil. Isn't that cool? You realize, look, all of these things, God's the one who establishes this stuff. And it's for our protection. And so that, could you imagine for one moment if there was no law enforcement in our own community? Could you imagine if we had no military that was protecting us as a nation? What would happen? Anarchy. It would be complete insanity. It would be the strong overpowering the weak. Whoever's got the biggest weapons would overtake those that don't. And what's amazing is that we find out that God is the one not only who establishes government, but God is the one who appoints people into government. That's what he tells us there in verse 13. He says, there is no authority except from God. And watch what he says, and those authorities exist, are appointed by God. Guys, whether you agree or you don't agree with any king or any president, or you got to come to this realization, is that God put him there. Our last president on the way out, God put him there. For the last 8 years, God put him there. Whether it was for our good or for our evil, that's for you to decide. And the new one coming in is because God put him there. Whether it's for our good or for our demise, we'll find out. Here's what the scripture says, Proverbs chapter 8, verse 15. Watch this. By me, God says, kings reign, and rulers decree justice. By me, princes rule, and nobles, all the judges of the earth. I love those who love me, and those who seek me diligently will find me. Interesting. God says, I'm the one who put him in place. What about Psalm 75, verse 6? It says this, for exaltation comes neither from the east, nor from the west, nor from the south. For God is the judge. He puts down one, and he exalts another. And I think for all of us, it's understanding this. It's this simple. If you believe that God is sovereign, and you believe that God is in control, then you also have to believe that God is the one who puts people into places of authority. You can't come to another conclusion. Otherwise, you're saying that he's not sovereign and that he's not in control. And it's interesting, in the time of Daniel, Daniel had lived under the king Nebuchadnezzar. King Nebuchadnezzar was a very vicious, very ruthless man. He's the one who sent armies from Babylon into Jerusalem and destroyed Jerusalem and took the people into captivity during that time. And this is what Daniel says in Daniel chapter 2, verse 20. He says this, "Praise be the name of God forever and ever. Wisdom and power are his. He changes times and seasons. He sets up kings and he disposes them." Wow. What a perspective coming from Daniel, who had been taken as a young boy from Jerusalem into foreign country, into Babylon as a captive. He says, understand something, man. God is the one who's in control. He would talk to Belshazzar, who was the son of Nebuchadnezzar, in Daniel chapter 5 and verse 18. And I love this passage because several times Daniel references that God's on the throne. Watch what he says in Daniel chapter 5, verse 18, all the way down to verse 21. Watch what he says. "O king, the most high God gave Nebuchadnezzar, your father, a kingdom and majesty and glory and honor. And because of the majesty that God gave him, all peoples, nations, languages trembled and feared before him. Whomever he wished, he executed, and whomever he wished, he kept alive. Whomever he wished, he set up, and whoever he wished, he put down. But when his heart was lifted up, and his spirit was hardened in pride, he was disposed from his kingly throne, and they took his glory from him. And he was driven from the sons of men. His heart was made like the beast, and his dwelling was with the wild donkeys. They fed him with grass like oxen, and his body was wet with the dew of heavens, till he knew that the Most High God rules in the kingdom of men and appoints over it whomever he chooses." Wow. That must have been a pretty awakening message for Belshazzar, who was about to be overtaken by the Greeks, as he realizes that God's the one who puts up and God's the one who takes down. God's the one who establishes, and God's the one who removes. You see, God's the one who's on the throne. And I think it's important for all of us that we understand that God is the one who sets things up. And as Christians, that we come to that realization that the authorities that God has placed over me are in positions of authority because God put them there. God put them there. Notice what he says there, beginning in verse 2 now. He says, therefore. Remember, every time he comes to the word therefore, he's now giving application to the things that he has just brought to our attention, and he wants us to understand that here's now the application of what he had just taught us. God's the one who's in charge of everything. God's the one who establishes kings and kingdoms. And then he says in verse 2, therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists the ordinance of God, and those who resist will bring judgment on themselves. And the word to resist there is to battle against, to oppose oneself against. Now, when you're fighting against and you're resisting against the authorities that God has established, you're really resisting and fighting against God. Think about that. They think about all these guys in the streets right now. They're not just fighting against a government. They're fighting against God's ordained plan. And so I think that helps us get a better perspective as you're watching the news and you're watching the craziness go on, is that this isn't just a peaceful protest. These guys are causing anarchy. They're breaking windows and burning cars and trying to destroy property and even hurting lives. This is a fight against God, because God is the one who established the authorities. And so really it's a lack of... And you can't expect someone who's not a Christian to live like a Christian. That's just the bottom line, right? But God has given this role within society that the government's supposed to play. And they were meant to bring order. They were meant to bring order into a culture, into a society that needs to be governed as God has told us here. Now, notice what he said there in verse 2. Once again, he says, whoever resists the authorities is resisting the ordinance of God. And those who resist, what happens? They bring judgment on themselves. They're bringing judgment upon themselves. Now, I remember when I was on the other team that I would just see a police officer and I would tense up. Right? Driving down the street, I'm all cool, everything's great. I see a cop. I knew I was guilty for something. Right? If they pulled me over, they would find something. I know it. So automatically, because I was on the wrong side, because I was in opposition, because I was doing things that were evil, what happens is that you right away, you know, I deserve to get busted. I'm driving the speed limit and I deserve to get busted. Because the reality is that the law or those that are working for the government have been given that role and responsibility to bring order. I like, again, one of the commentators, this is R.C. Sproul wrote this, to govern means to impose obligations that are backed up with sanctions if a person refuses to obey. Coercion is forcing people to obey laws. We not only have laws, but law enforcement agencies. The purpose of law enforcement agencies is to coerce obedience to the law, to force people to obey the mandates of the government. The government is force in that it alone has the right to use coercion to bring people into certain patterns of behavior. I like that. You see, guys, only the government's been given that responsibility. The church doesn't have that responsibility to by coercion, force people to obey. I don't have a secret council, it just goes off with his head, right? I don't have that power, that ability to do so. You see, that's the government's role. And the government has been given that responsibility, and you and I as good citizens, and you and I as Christians, because we understand that God is the ultimate authority, and we bring ourselves under His authority, and He's the one who established that authority, then we bring ourselves under that authority. And not only that, we're to be grateful for their service and understand that God has put them in that position. I like when Peter writes in 1 Peter chapter 2, Romans, the persecution hasn't broken out in Rome yet, and Paul's still writing this, but Peter is after the dispersion, and they had already been in the middle of persecution when he writes 1 Peter chapter 2. And let me read to you verse 13. 1 Peter 2:13 says this, therefore, submit yourself to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake, whether to the king as supreme, or to governors, or to those who are sent by him for the punishment of evildoers, and for the praise of those who do good. For this is the will of God, that by doing good you may put to silence the ignorance of foolish men, as free, yet not using your liberty as a cloak for vice, but as bondservants of God. Watch what he says. He sums it up. Honor all people. Love the brotherhood. Fear God. Honor the king. And that's the Christian responsibility. We're to be model citizens. We're to be those who acknowledge that these guys that are in authority, they've been placed there by God. And he even goes a step further as you look in verse 5. Watch what he says in verse 4, that is. Verse 4. That's what he says. For he is God's minister for you, for good. He's God's minister. Those that are holding people to account for the law, they're God's minister. That word minister is the word diakonos, and the word diakonos is one who executes the commandments of another, of a master, a servant, attendant, a minister. You ever heard that word? He's a public servant. That's really what it's supposed to be. That person who's has the authority to enforce the law is doing so under God's authority, and they're ministers of God. They've been given this role and responsibility to execute wrath on him who practices evil. Wow. So if you're practicing evil and the authorities are coming after you, that's what they should be doing. It's their role and responsibility. Matter of fact, watch what he says at the end of verse 4. He says, if you do evil, for he is God's minister, watch this, an avenger to execute wrath on him who practices evil. Think about the implications of that. He's saying, if you're practicing evil, the authorities that have been set up have the authority from God to render vengeance, to render justice. Now, I can't take justice into my own hands, but the governing bodies that exist have a responsibility of taking justice into their hands. And so he wants us to be and I think it's also a very important note here is that they've been given the sword. What's the sword? That's the form of power or the ability to execute. And that's been given to the governing authorities. That's a heavy idea here. He says that really you and I are to bring ourselves under subjection to those authorities, and the authorities have the ability to on behalf of God, to bring order and to bring justice into a society and into a culture. I think there's the idea of, and I've heard this over and over, and for the longest time I thought it was actually something that was right. It was you cannot govern morality. You've heard that before? You can't govern morality. Isn't that what the government does every day? Govern morality. If someone commits murder, isn't the responsibility of the government to take that murder and put him into jail and to give him a trial and then to give him a sentence so that he's able to pay for doing evil? You can govern morality. Can you imagine a day when the government says, it doesn't matter if you commit murder anymore, everything's fine? Well, what's going to happen in our society? No, we're to govern evil. And evil is immoral behavior. And once we have a government that starts to say, it doesn't matter what you do or how you act or whether you kill or whether you don't, you see, now you have anarchy again. And so he tells us very clearly, look, these governing authorities have a responsibility, and they have the right to vengeance, also the right to delegate instruments of vengeance. This is precisely what we learn in this verse, that God delegates the civil magistrates a certain measure of vengeance, making the civil magistrates a minister of vengeance on God's behalf. So it is within the province of civil magistrate to seek retribute justice. It is within the province of the state to punish the evildoer. Wow. Can you imagine if our society actually punished fairly those that are doing evil? I think we would have a lot less crime. I think we would have, if someone murdered, and that now that has there's a certain payment for that, and yet we've kind of become more and more liberal in our giving of justice. And what does it cause? It causes more and more breaking of the laws that are put into place. It's interesting that Paul would address this, especially for this reason, guys. Think about what was happening in Jerusalem at the time. The Romans were over Israel. And the Jews in Israel despised them for it. They were angry all the time that these heathens have come in and now they're ruling over us. And the question for the church is are we to act like Israel's acting and Jerusalem's acting when they're now disrespecting the governing authorities and always trying to rebel against them? And so Paul writes to the church and he says, look, as Christians, that's not our responsibility. Matter of fact, as Christians, we understand that God's in control. We understand that God's the one on the throne. And that he places the ones that are in power, and he disposes the ones that he doesn't want in power. God's able to do that. And he's been able to do that from the beginning of time. And so he tells us there in verse 5 now, watch what he says. Therefore, there's that word again, therefore. Here's the application to that. You must be subject not only because of wrath, but also for conscience sake. He says, you, Christian. You don't do it just because there's a consequence for doing it. You don't steal, lie, cheat, rob, murder just because there's a consequence for doing it. You're doing it because you're under God's authority. And you have a conscience that if I rebel against society and against the government or against the culture, then I'm going to be accountable to God for these things. And because I have a conscience toward God, I now come under subjection to the authorities that are placed over me. Now, it's Paul laying out these things for them, and he's really wanting the church to be a model citizen. That should be all of us, guys. We should be model citizens. Not just to our government. We should be model employees. We should be model employers. We should be the good sportsmen on the baseball field or on the football field. Because we're not giving an answer to the authorities that are in front of us, although we do, we also give an answer to God who's above them. And so he wanted them to understand that they were to not only render respect, but watch what he says now as he moves into the 6th verse. And I think this even gets more interesting. Look what he says in verse 6. For because of this you also pay taxes. For they are God's ministers attending continually to this very thing. He goes, because of this, you pay your taxes. Now, again, there was two things I didn't want to deal with at all were police officers and the IRS. Those are the two. My dad had a business growing up. He was a contractor, and a lot of times I'd end up doing my dad's books. And I remember, we were always, trying to make sure we're paying the IRS bills. But when we got a call from the IRS, it was just like, oh no, not the IRS. And I remember I can tell you multiple times I'd see the phone ring, and I know it's the IRS number. Like, I'm not picking that up. I don't even want to talk to them. But he says, hey, you're to fund those that are protecting you and those that are doing the job that they were given to do, that we have a responsibility to pay our taxes. As a Christian, you're rendering, and he's going to use that word in a second. It's an interesting word because the word render means to deliver, to give away for one's own profit what is one's own, to pay off, to discharge what is due. I mentioned earlier the Jews despised the Romans. And to think of paying taxes to the Romans, I mean, it was one thing that they were ruling over them, but now you're going to make us pay taxes for you to rule over us. I mean, you got to be kidding me. And the Pharisees and the Herodians knew that, and they came to Jesus with a question. They came to Jesus with a question to try to pit. Any way Jesus is going to answer this question, do I pay taxes to Caesar? I do not pay taxes to Caesar. Any way he's going to answer that, it's going to be a trap. Because if he says, pay taxes to Caesar, all the Jews are going to go, we shouldn't pay taxes to Caesar, you're wrong, right? And if he says, don't pay taxes to Caesar, then you got the Roman government chasing you. So either he was going to disenfranchise his followers, or he was going to get in trouble with the Roman government. And Jesus, in Matthew chapter 22, verse 16, it tells us, and they went to him, their disciples with the Herodians, those are the Pharisees with the Herodians, and they said, Teacher, we know that you are true, and you teach the way of God in truth, nor do you care about anyone, for you do not regard the persons of men. Did you like how they're setting them up for that? They're setting them, they're going, Jesus, you're just a man's man. You don't care what anybody thinks. You're just going to say it like it is. And I know what you're going to, they're trying to play on Jesus, thinking that Jesus is going to bite, right? They go, Jesus, you don't care about anybody. You're just going to say it. So we got a question for you, and we just want a man's answer here, Jesus. Tell us. What do you think? Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? And Jesus perceived their wickedness. And he said, why do you test me, you hypocrites? I love Jesus. You guys are trying to mess with me. You bunch of phonies. Show me the tax money. So they brought him a denarius. And he said to them, whose image and inscription is this? And they said, Caesar's. And he said to them, render therefore to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. Wow. Isn't that awesome? I can just see Jesus looking at the coin, and there's Caesar's big head. There's Caesar's head. It's just sitting there, and he goes, hey, whose face is that, guys? That's Caesar's. Then give Caesar's what's his. Ooh. What do you say to that? And then he says something profound. He says, and give to God what is God's. Guys, you and I were made in the image of God. You got God's image stamped on you. And God isn't looking for anything but you. He's looking for you. And if you're going to give to God what is God's, what that means is that you're going to give God everything. And it's an incredible picture, because what Jesus is saying is, and I think what Paul is saying in this passage is that, look, you're receiving the benefits of the government. They're fulfilling the role that God intended them to fulfill, and therefore you have an obligation to give them what's due them. If you're receiving the benefits of the government you're under, then you have the responsibility to fund the government you're under. That's why taxes are, it's a biblical concept. Well, you and I should be paying taxes. And I think that whole idea, it bleeds over into everything that if we're benefiting from something, we should be supporting that thing we're benefiting from. That's why the local church, if you're benefiting from the local church, it should be, man, I'm part of this. I should be helping support it. That's how the church is supposed to function. And if you're ripping off the government or you're ripping off God, you see, you're in that same realm. Because you're receiving the benefits without giving any support, and that's how the government operates. And it's why you and I have an army that's able to protect us, and it's why we have a police force that's able to answer the 911 call when you give a call, and the fire truck was able to come and put out the fire at your house, is because the citizens are able to fund them and give them the ability to do that. And so I think it's a very important thing that he's laying out for us. He's saying, look, if you're the beneficiary, then you should be also one who's contributing to. And that's exactly what Paul is saying. Look what he says. Again, look what he says. Therefore, because of this, because of what? Because the government's responsibility, you are to render, therefore, their due. No, I jumped verse 6. He says, for because of this, you also pay taxes, for they are God's ministers, attending continually to this very thing. It goes, they're dedicating their time and their life to doing that, and therefore you should be helping support that. And I think as Christians, we're still a couple months away, but it will be in a couple months that all of us are filling out our tax returns and fulfilling, paying our taxes and doing the things that we're supposed to be doing. And it should be something we do with the acknowledgement that this is how God's ordained it. And this is my responsibility as a Christian and as a citizen of the country. But not only that, that's what he says in verse 7, and I think here's the bigger perspective here. He says, render therefore to all their due taxes. To whom taxes are due, I say, render therefore to all their due, taxes to whom taxes are due, customs to whom customs, fear to whom fear, and honor to whom honor. He says, look, you're to render what's due. It's due. Think about that picture, due. I mean, if you have a mortgage, you know what that means, right? Due on December 1st. And you go, that's the due date. I got to pay it by, and that's true of any service that you provide. You got a water bill, you got a gas bill. There's a due date that has to be. It's due. It's what you owe. That's the idea. And in every area of life, if you owe something, you have a responsibility to make good on that. Because you made the agreement. If you provide this service, then I'm going to give you X amount of money. If you pay my house, I'm going to pay you back in increments with interest over such a amount of time. And now that becomes what you owe. It's what's due. And so he says, look, taxes to whom taxes are due. That's what you owe. Customs to whom customs. And then he says this, fear to whom fear. Guys, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And that should be where, because I fear God, man, I'm going to bring myself under the authorities that He's established, and I'm not going to be an anarchist. I'm not going to be a rebellion against the things that God's established. I realize that I'm the beneficiary of these things, and therefore, because I fear God, I'm going to do the things that God's asked me to do. And then He just simply says, to whom honor, honor. You see, we're told that we're to honor our parents. That's a good thing. You're to show respect. We're to honor those who are in authority over us. That's also a biblical concept. We're to honor them. You're to honor the elderly. We're to show them respect. I think this idea of honor has been lost in our culture. Right now, to be a police officer is a very dangerous thing to be, because there's a target, because there's no honor for the authorities that have been established. And so now, rather than being honored, they're being despised. And I'm praying for our men and women in a uniform, because they have a very tough job to do with a society that doesn't want to render honor to honor is due, and doesn't want to come under authority. Now, understand there's evil even in the midst of that. There's been bad cops that have done bad things, and they need to be held accountable for the things they've done. But to put a blanket that all police officers are our enemies, that's not biblical. And I think it's dangerous. I want to conclude this, and I think very timely, man. Can you imagine us being right here, and especially with what's going on around us, that we're seeing the civil unrest, we're seeing anarchy, we're seeing rebellion, and all these things taking place. But that should never be how you and I act as Christians. And I would be giving this message no matter who won this election. The reality is that for the 8 years prior, I wasn't in agreement with a lot of the policies of our current president. I wasn't, but I understand that I have the responsibility to support him, because I support the office that God has established, no matter whether I agree with that or not, except when, and here's where I want to go with this, is that we are to obey those authorities as long as it doesn't cause us to disobey God. Those authorities are in place. We're to come under their submission and under their authority until the day that they say, okay, now you have to do something that is going to be in rebellion to God in order to be in obedience to me. I think of the midwives in Egypt who didn't kill Moses, even though they were commanded by the king, by Pharaoh, to do so. Exodus chapter 1, verse 17, it says this, but the midwives feared God, and they did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but they saved the male children alive. You see, they were telling them to abort the kids. the males, immediately. As soon as the battle was bird, you were to drown them, you were to kill them immediately. And the midwife said, you know what? We fear God more than we fear man. So no matter what the consequence is, I'm going to stand on God's side here. I see that's where the line's drawn. Think about Nebuchadnezzar building a huge idol. And he told Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego that whenever the trumpet blew, if they didn't bow down and worship that idol, they're going to be thrown into the furnace, the fiery furnace. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego said, hey, we already made up our mind, King. You might as well get that fire nice and hot. Because we ain't bowing down. And they got thrown into the fire. And this is the cool thing. It says there wasn't 3 in the fire. There was 4. And one looks like the Son of Man. That God was with them in the middle of the fire. That's the biblical stand. And then you look at Daniel. Remember Daniel? Daniel was told, and a decree was made, that no one can pray to anyone except the king. And if you broke that command, you'd be thrown into the lion's den to be eaten by lions. And Daniel knew the decree. He was one of the higher ups he was actually one of the highest positions in the kingdom of Nebuchadnezzar. And Daniel went home that day, and it says just like he always did, he opened up his windows. He faced the east toward Jerusalem, and he prayed to the God of heaven. Morning, noon, and night. Now, it would have been really easy for Daniel to go, man, you know what, I close my window, I'll just kind of, I'll still do what I'm doing, I'll still be praying, but now I'm going to do it secretly rather than openly. He could have prayed and just under his breath said his prayer, but Daniel did just like he always did. He opened up his windows and he was facing where God had told him to face, and Daniel prayed every day just like he had always prayed. And he knew that the decree meant that he was going to be thrown into the lion's den, and he did it anyway, no matter what the consequence. He was thrown into the lion's den. You remember the story. The lions there with Daniel all night long. An angel had one of the lions in a headlock. All night long. That he shut the mouths of the lion. You see, guys, there is a higher authority, and that authority is God. And anytime someone tells us that we can't do what God said to do, then that's where we draw the line. If it's outside of that realm, then we're to come under the authorities that be. Once it crosses that line, then you and I have a responsibility to do what God says above what man says. It's an interesting passage in the book of Acts chapter 5. The apostles are arrested, they're beaten because they had healed the man, and they were teaching in the name of Jesus, and they were threatened. Don't you ever talk in the name of Jesus anymore. And he threatened them pretty severely, and they were arrested again. And these Sanhedrin, the ruling body, the authority in Jerusalem, came to them and said, did we strictly command you not to teach in this name? And look, you fill Jerusalem with your doctrine and intend to bring this man's blood on us. And Peter and the other apostles answered and said, we ought to obey God rather than men. And there's where you and I stand. I'd rather obey God rather than men. And so when we come to that place where it's, do we obey the government? Do we obey and that's causing us to do something that God said not to do? That's where I draw the line. And that's where you draw the line, I think, in every other area of authority. When in the workplace, when you're told to lie or cheat or to forge or to connive in something, and you go, wait a second, man, I can't do that. I'm a Christian. And if you want me to lie or cheat, you got to find someone else, because I won't do it. Well, you're going to get fired. Do what you got to do. Because my stand is I'm going to stand with God in spite of the consequences. That's who we are as Christians. Now, I heard the story of a man by the name of Pastor Martin Neumöller. Martin Neumöller was a pastor when the Nazis came into power, and the Nazis were pursuing their racist policies. They were beginning to arrest the Jews, and this pastor, Martin Niemöller, continued to preach the truth. And as a result of it, he was thrown into prison. The prison chaplain, upon visiting Niemöller, asks somewhat foolishly, "What brings you here? Why are you in prison?" To which Niemöller replied angrily, "And brother, why are you not in prison?" Guys, if it comes down to it, the question is not going to be who you're loyal to, it's going to be who's your authority. Who's your authority? And my prayer is that your authority, as mine, is the creator of heaven and earth. And no matter what the world would say, man, I'm standing with him. And that would be really, I think Paul lays out such an incredible passage here. Next week, we're just in an amazing section of Scripture, and I would encourage you to read ahead next week, verses 8 through 10, and we'll see if we can get through those verses. But I just encourage you to ponder those this week, because you and I have been given a higher authority to live our lives by. And it's amazing. Maybe you're here this morning and you're like, man, that's so coincidence that we're in Romans chapter 13. Let me tell you this, man. God does this over and over again. This blows my mind that he would put us right there, right now. That we would be in this section of Scripture. I couldn't have picked a better passage to look at this morning, because I think all of us are having to answer these questions, and then have to answer, how do I process this stuff? And I hope as a Christian you understand this is what our role is. And if you don't have Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior, Jesus said this. Jesus says this to his disciples. He says, "Why do you call me Lord, Lord, if you don't do the things that I say?" You see, he's not your Lord unless you come under his authority. He's not your Lord unless you say, "God, your will, not my will." You can call him Lord, but that's not the reality. And if Jesus Christ is not your Lord this morning, if he's not the one who rules over your decisions, he's not the one who rules over your life, he's not the one that you go, "God, what do you say concerning this matter? And that's what I'm going to do," then I would encourage you this morning to evaluate that and then make a decision who you want to rule over your life. There's multiple choices. You can rule over your life. This world can rule over you, or Satan can rule over you. Or God can rule over you.